So you must have entered something wrong.
Yeah, it started already. We're going to see a little bit of somebody confused.
That's me.
Okay, so could I have connect to the blue jean sync as well? True, very true. Let's see if I have the wireless guest key. Okay, just use these instructions. This is the password to get into the wireless network. You're gonna sign in as a guest. Since you're on a PC, I'm assuming it's a Windows machine. Just follow the 3 steps right here.
Do you need us for anything?
If you can, you get up to your room, just say something to us to make sure that the audio is both ways. We'll say something back to you also. Because I think that was one of the things we had a problem with the last time. Okay. Okay.
And I need to connect to the link that carries.
Yes, that's right. Now what's going to happen is this. Once you're on, it's going to record you from your laptop. So if you move across the room back and forth, the people who are watching remotely, they might not be confused because they'll still hear your voice. But without the audio and the visual connection, they might think that...
so I have to be here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Because this is the only camera that's captured.
Okay. And, but the projection will be over there.
Yes, that's right.
Because I might be
well,
showing something.
We'll test it.
Maybe I can put my laptop somewhere here.
If you're connected to the wires for power, I don't think you could go too far.
Okay, good. Then I stick to this.
Okay. I have a laser pointer, so maybe you won't have to go back and forth.
Yeah, okay, maybe that too. Okay, good.
At the top. Yes. Okay, so once you're connected, we'll just do a couple samples of your slides as if you're really doing the talk, just to make sure everything seems to be working. Great. And I'll leave this with you, just in case you need it for the rest of the day. It's our wireless password if you get disconnected.
All right, so Alma, who you just met.
Okay, so how I project?
Share content. There's something probably on the slide panel that says you can share with the rest of the attendees.
Share screen.
Yeah, yes, right there. then I'm going to have you just present like the first few slides to make sure that if anyone's watching.
So I don't actually need. I don't need this session.
It does. Yeah. Okay. Now what is that? Hello? Hey, Alma, do you hear us? Okay. We'll wait a few minutes, and if you get on, just say something to us, and we'll say something back. Okay, thanks.
You're right. It's a good point. A lot of our talks that we do and the meetings that we hold are always on site. Now that we're doing it a little bit different.
I hope I won't hear my voice, but this is really.
Yeah, there's a reverb,
Yeah.
and I don't know if there's really much we can do about that, though. But once Alma gets on, we'll just test this to make sure that, again, whoever's watching.
All the other participants that hear you. Okay. If anything might result in it, you may want to.
But this is really, I would say, it's really confusing.
Yeah, I think due to the fact that we need to record it, this is the only way.
Hello.
Hey, Emilio. How are you?
Hey, Goran. Nice to meet you.
So this is the first time thing moving the meetings on site to the live recording. I know the mics seem a little bit echo, but this is really the only way if you want.
It looks like most of the people are traveling for whatever the reason this week, so we'll need to record it because I already got a couple of requests. There is no way to get this.
I called facilities. We'll see if we can make it a little bit less. Like
Just the volume of this.
We just turn off the speakers here. We don't need to hear.
Yeah, some
Myself.
will be coming in.
Yes.
Let's see.
The other thing was, would you mind just going through your slides really quick? Let me make sure that works.
Videos.
Yeah.
Do you wanna?
Well, let me test the video.
Yeah, let's plug this in too. This will be the audio for the video.
It will not be a problem, but video will be a problem.
Be right back.
Okay. Yeah, because the speakers.
How was your trip?
It was really nice. Long.
Yeah. You've been here in Los Angeles.
I've been once. And I also have friends here, so I hope it's
Nice.
pretty.
And you mentioned you
Nice excuse. Yeah. It works. Actually, everything is really interesting. That I stay at the friends which are 2 streets away, like 10 minutes walk. And my wife works in a company called Telesign, which is here under the corner.
Oh, you're in Maria, right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's working.
Did you hear me?
Okay, it's not that smooth, but it's good. Okay.
I can see the presentation.
Yeah, Alma.
All right. Since Alma's on the line with us right now, could you just present like your first slide? It doesn't have to be thorough, but she just wants to make sure she can see what you're doing.
Okay, so this is my first slide. I'm going to talk about the spreading mechanism.
I can hear
Can
people.
you hear me?
Can you hear me on there? Not on the phone, but on in the room. Okay. So I'm going to hang up. Yes.
Okay. Just want to let you know we're doing feedback. So if you have to do this again, try to do it.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. All right. So while the people who are traveling are going to That's just like they can see it here.
But it's gonna be recorded.
Yeah, it's recording right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I called somebody. Hopefully, they'll come down right now. Oh, maybe. You looking for something? Yeah, we're doing a BTC call with this. Yeah, is there something on in here? Like, is there his laptop? Shut your microphone on your laptop.
No, but then other people will not be able to hear. Or maybe they think.
Of course.
Okay, then go.
That's absolute feedback.
Yeah, okay. Mm. Actually.
So the mics are.
Yeah,
What about now?
you work. Go ahead and say something.
Something. Something.
Okay.
Looks fine.
Okay.
There is still like a minimal amount, but I think it's fine.
So this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go upstairs to make sure that
Just
again,
dial in.
yeah, and then I want
I
to see
can
whatever
hear.
he says can be.
Oh
fixed.
yeah, sure.
Okay, and what about now? It's even better.
Maybe fix it.
Maybe not even better. Yeah.
Like have somebody dial in. That's what happens when the computer, because these mics are on with the cameras and everything else. So the feedback loop is from.
Because I thought they are going to hear me through my mic.
No.
But it's this mic.
Yeah.
It's much better. Yeah.
Yeah. Nate, would you mind if we connect your computer?
Yeah. Let's.
Okay.
Okay, so that was easy, which is good
That's
news.
the easy part.
So did you finish your PhD? I saw there was August 17.
I finished my PhD. Yes.
And
it was August 23rd.
You are
defended
done. Okay. So right now you are in Dresden, or you are in?
Right now I'm in Belgrade.
Okay.
I moved out from
I
Dresden
see.
a few weeks ago.
So you're working in this same place as before where you did your master, or you are just?
Now I don't work anywhere.
Oh, okay. So
So
you worked in Belgrade before.
I
That's
worked
where
in
you're
Belgrade.
from, right?
Yes, I'm from Belgrade. Then I spent some time in Dresden.
Right.
Now I'm unemployed.
Okay. Okay. So you're like.
Yeah, cool.
Let's say you are interviewing.
No, I'm in between jobs. Let's
Right.
put it like that. But actually, I'm kind of not rushing, and I'm giving myself.
Do you hear us?
Time to think.
We
We can hear.
hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Maybe not anymore. I don't know if you are mute.
Not
maybe.
anymore.
What we're seeing, you are sharing your screen. That's what I'm seeing.
We can see your lips, but we cannot hear you now. We could hear you earlier on. Okay, so
Did you hear Nate?
we could hear Nate early on, but now it doesn't work anymore. Maybe he's muted, or maybe there was some.
Could you share your screen again for me?
I think it's sharing. Over there.
Yes. Put on one slide, and then we're gonna just do a two-way test to see if we can hear you. Obviously, you can't hear Nate. Okay. Let me see if he muted his mic. In the meantime, would you mind just how about count to 60 to make sure
Yeah,
that we
okay.
can still hear you well?
1, 2, 3. Do you hear me? 5, 10, 15, 11, 25, 13, 20, 21, 23, 51, 52, 53, 54, 5, 6, 10.
Hello.
Test. We are testing. Can you hear? Maybe not.
I can hear you.
Yeah, they can.
Okay.
He's nodding. but the volume from the calls is low, but it doesn't matter because I don't think anyone is gonna try to jump
He
in.
said he could hear you, which is
Okay,
important.
okay, so we're all good. It's recording and the flash function, and there is nothing there. So
Okay.
I think this is the best
Okay.
we can ask for. Okay, so let's, we will need to wait at least 10 more minutes because I know that there's a lot of other talks and stuff going on. So, maybe can you circulate the link again?
I'll tell Carrie. She's the one that
Oh, yeah, yeah.
sends it out.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot. No problem.
Advantage of well, the nice thing about having the talk recorded is that people can see it later. So it's gonna be, online in there is this YouTube channel, but I don't know if you can decide whether it should be public or not.
Let's see if I make some
major
mistakes. Then.
But aside from that, there is always the link that is being generated that people can just click.
It's really nice how well it works here. I mean, I've been studying in Germany, and they are always kind of a bit behind those new. They stick to their own systems, and they work some more other way. So they also dislike if someone is attending defense online.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So they kind of
want the people to be there.
Yeah, to be there.
This is not going to be, for a number of reasons, it's not like that because, as you can imagine, a lot of people travel for conferences, for meetings, or simply just because they're always on the fly. So, today, so you have your agenda?
Yes.
I think there is one change that we will go to lunch, and we will stay a little bit over because Pedro is actually home, and we'll go to lunch with two of my other postdocs. We'll get to chat with them. So Hannah and Homa, they will join us to lunch, and. Yeah, everything is the same. There are a lot of people actually who are not on your schedule today who are other professors or in general, research scientists or whatever who usually interview all the candidates because differently from I think many other places, the way it works is that every person that we hire, there is a collegial vote, a committee vote. So basically everyone.
I actually didn't know how it works.
It's not too different from whenever you're interviewed for, say, like a tenure track professor position, something like that. So you get to talk with a lot of people, and then there's a discussion, there's a committee. In many other places, it's really only like you're going to interview with one or two people, and if they like it, they will offer you a postdoc because it's usually short amount of time, 1, 2, 3 years at most, but the year is much more.
As far as I understood, this is also really limited.
So there is actually a really but it's actually a really good point because there is so for someone who is at the beginning of their career, many people in the past have started as postdocs, spend 2, 3, 4 years and then become promoted. I mean, you can have a career inside the university without the need to leave. There are people who are here for 30 years.
Okay.
Or 30 years, 25 years and so on. So that's not, there is not a presumption that someone would necessarily leave or that anyone is a clock. Which is a good thing. It's different from maybe more traditional postdocs where that there's this project, they need someone for that project. Once the project is over, the contract expires and so on.
So people here work on different projects, or they work on several projects?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Most of the postdocs work at least on one project. So usually 2 projects. So you get to chat with many of the. So on your So, by the way, he's Fred, who's gonna talk to you later today. Fred is a computer scientist. He also graduated not long ago, around June, so a couple of months before you. And he started in August.
Yeah.
So, less than half a year ago. And home, I've been here, I guess. Been here for how much? Like a year. Yeah, so the other ones are.
You also connected on blue jeans, so I was hearing.
Sorry, fine.
I don't have your phone number, right?
I don't know. Do you want it?
Yeah. I was trying to send you an emoji.
Okay. Okay, I'll write it down for you.
Follow up with Carrie today, and she will ask you some of your availabilities to come to private for fun. So that you can
It's interesting process.
Yeah.
It's
a good practice. We usually start about 5 minutes late so that later on it's planned so that people have time to know from other talks.
How long have you been? Have you been here?
Okay.
Because our plans for me and my wife was to come to LA because she got position also in her company here, and so I'm exploring right now. Also.
Yeah, and there are a lot of. LA is a great place to work anyways, aside from the university, because there is just a very huge expansion of industry. Not far from here. I mean, there are companies here in Marina del Rey, but in Playa Vista, which is about, you can see it from here. I don't know why they keep all these windows down, because the view is kind of very cool. But if you basically around that hill, go around, and that's Playa Vista, Playa del Rey, and there are like even Google, Facebook, Yahoo was there. I think they're shutting down that office, but I mean there are so many like major companies, Amazon, and so on. So we'll see. So Fred, is your fiance going to move here?
I hope so. That's what we're working on right now. Is she's trying to find a job.
And she works for Intel.
Yeah, that's right.
In
Sorry?
Intel.
Yeah. And so she's applied to a few places, but none of them have like exactly what she does. It's like this micro processor fabrication stuff. So, I hope so. It takes time, yeah.
Good luck.
Thanks.
When I had to, was looking around, I had a bunch of offers from other places. Actually all of them were East Coast, and some were major cities like New York, and some other major middle were like New York State or New Jersey State and so on. So we were looking around here. Actually, my wife got a job earlier than so I like okay.
Yeah.
I will find a job there. And she actually found a job like
Is this the liquidation?
so she started like earlier than
The football paper?
That's awesome. But now it's actually there are not so many workers
I have to get all these names.
but there are more like
What's up?
Are you reviewing some interesting papers?
Yeah, some various stuff. I just wanted that was kind of like a physics paper. It's quite interesting actually. It's a nice paper. It's always good to get nice ones because you actually learn some stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Whereas other ones, that's where it's frustrating.
Yeah.
So I want to review now for Siam dance.
As a STM.
Okay. Yeah, science.
Sam, data mining.
Data mining, yeah.
Sam,
so they made things your brain.
Yeah, I'm reviewing one of the papers there. So I was also reviewing one of the STM papers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so there is a
Which one is it?
It is on link regression.
Okay.
Link regression function. the authors combined citations is 150,000.
So yours on your
What?
150,000.
Wow.
So one was 80,000,
Oh,
one
okay.
was 50,000.
So she works at the one in like a
Yeah, so
oh,
yours is
okay.
the one that's like
Yeah.
But I do
Ah,
some
okay.
sort of regular.
Good morning.
I apply less. How are you? In order to select the variables from the external sequence.
It's good.
Just got back.
Because I
You're
rejected it.
fine.
Traveling for 7 weeks.
So I'm
I mean, the idea was good.
I'm very excited
These
to
are
travel to
people
see you all.
Really?
There.
So I've never heard of Siam Data meeting. Is it a big conference?
I went to
Is it like
Armenia.
ICDM? Same level?
Yes, it is almost similar.
Oh,
Had
okay.
this Atlantic
Is it the
conference.
most like
to say is how
Siam is
topics
kind of
are
like mathematics is the most like data science wing of Siam?
that as external sequence.
It's actually
How was your trip?
Yeah, that would one way.
Yeah.
Heidelberg
Oh, it was
thing.
great. Yeah.
It's still somewhat
Yeah, it was a lot of
mathematics.
fun. I
Somewhat
enjoyed it.
mathematical, but it is still like data mining. And
I'll come back.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
this
please
they
do.
were particularly like they were using
the
all very old methods. The latest references was gone seven.
No way.
So they were doing some kind of time series prediction and they had no references after 2007.
Nice.
Not necessarily.
It's like
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah.
When they were academics, maybe.
So we have a friend who actually managed to
But
get because
interesting problem. I was also planning to work on somewhat similar.
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
And it's an interesting thing to say.
So my understanding is like you can only go once at each like level. So like if you're a grad student, you can go once and then go once as close to that. So I guess
How's everything
maybe you and I both got out of it too.
In both cases,
We're both much better as like that.
you don't have to work with
So yeah,
yeah,
just
like
yeah.
Okay. Are you something like Epidemics?
Actually,
Yeah, it's January, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
what day is it?
January.
13.
but I would like
Yeah, I
to
think maybe
do
when that's next month, when it was super
So you can
So
submit
I
external
think my next one, I'll submit to a journal.
You must provide external
You
sequence.
submit to journals.
Yeah. One journal.
Yeah.
Submitting the survey to the journal.
Yeah, okay.
But ideally,
That's where I met Mayan.
Just kind of a Oh, really?
Yeah, I met Mayan there before.
Yeah, so other papers I have like I'm working on other papers in the previous advisor.
Yeah, actually,
to a journal. We haven't
the
tried
fellow
to
that you,
Oh, I think.
journals can be
yeah, he was there.
it's a very long review.
Yeah, that's the great thing about conferences. It's very fast. It's great. It's really good.
Exactly. I don't
very
the journal just like you can forget about like
It's like you never
getting
see
published in the
people
next
topics.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Nice. Exactly.
It can be frustrating, you know, it's such a long process. Like
No, you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. It's funny actually. Yeah.
If you know,
Yeah.
always count the number of times you are in a
Sure,
like
like review for just getting knowledge. Yeah, there were a few that were terrible. Like ones that really like had high knowledge. Yeah.
for content.
I don't see why.
But some,
Some people probably should say that about their speaking here, you know. Nice obviously you have major revisions to do, but I mean,
I think
unless you have lots of views on your table.
I think this it's just has been
Our
established
past
like that.
Yeah, that's true actually.
If they were asked to do it in 1 month, they would have done it.
Okay, so I suggest we get started.
Yeah, it was actually.
Sorry, there is some problem with the
Okay.
network. I don't know what's. Okay, now it's.
is it working? Or maybe it's a glitch in the Wi-Fi. Reconnecting, so it's not casting the screen anymore. If you pull this up, that's not show.
Oh, it's. I don't think actually that kind of here.
Okay, so the
I will try to reconnect.
sure. So the test Wi-Fi stopped working, so it's a good excuse to wait a couple more minutes to do this troubleshooting. Feel free to chat. Sorry, they don't want to interrupt. This works. So you're on the side.
Palash sent me an emoji. I don't know, he has an iPhone Max.
Then you have to play it with sound later.
Oh, there's sound.
There's sound.
Alright, that's good news. Okay, so this was easy to fix. So let's get started. So my pleasure to have Goran Muric. Muric. Today for an interview, Goran just graduated from Technical University of Dresden.
He spent there a couple of years. He worked essentially in network science, especially on cascading of failures, and this is the topic that he's going to talk about today. Before that, he got a master in computer science from Belgrade University, and he spent several months working in the AI lab at Vrije University in Brussels on a variety of different topics. So please welcome Goran.
Thank you. First, thank you all for coming to listen to my talk. So, as Emilia told, my name is Goran Muric, and I just recently finished my PhD in Germany, in telecommunication. So actually, when I started my PhD, I had many ideas. I was so excited. I want to do this, I want to do that. We can change the world and stuff like that. But then quickly I realized it's not going to be exactly like that. First of all, the half of those ideas were already done, like some 20 years ago. And another half of the ideas were just bad ideas. So then I also realized that I'm not particularly intelligent. And that's, that was a kind of big impact to one student's self-esteem. However, I was a bit stubborn, and with the great help of my supervisor there, we managed to produce some meaningful results. And now I'm going to present some of those results. And my talk will be about the spreading failures within the network and how to fight them. And since I see you are going to be a good audience, I will give you a small bonus. That's a small talk about the game theory experiment which we did in artificial lab in Brussels. Artificial intelligence lab, sorry. So actually network failures happen on a regular basis. They sometimes spread and they are very difficult to predict. So in my research I try to analyze and prevent such failures. So the main idea, main umbrella topic, umbrella question was how to make networks more resilient against spreading failures. So I divided spreading failures in two groups. The first one is cascades, and another are epidemics. So they are both similar and different. So both cascades and epidemics originate in a small fraction of nodes, and then they spread through the networks. But the mechanism of the failure is different, and also the consequences are a little bit different. So therefore, I have two subgroups of results. The one deals with epidemics and the most important spreaders in the network, and another group deals with cascading failures analysis within the particular network. So first I'm going to present this part. We actually proposed a new measure for the node importance, and we have some kind of theoretical contribution here, and we combine system theory and complex network analysis. So that's our contribution there. So the main principle was to transform network into LTI system, and then analyze the system. By LTI, I mean linear time invariant system. So linear, it means that the input and the output system have linear relation. And the time invariant, it means that it doesn't change over time that we observe. So how we usually analyze LTI systems, that we have put some input signal into the system, and then we observe the output, which means that we observe the response of the system. As the inputs, we usually use impulse function, and then we observe the impulse response. Or we use step function. I'm usually used to be in front of the step function, then we use step response, and then we have for some other sinusoidal function, for example. So this is one of the ways how we can represent the LTI systems. I usually try to avoid putting too many formulas on slides, but since this is interview talk, I have to look smart. So this is, this is one of the most important formulas in system theory. So it's a state space representation of a system. And how we read it. So we have some matrices and some vectors. And so they are all in these differential equations, and then they connect input and output for the system. So, for example, we have this matrix A. It's called system matrix. Down there, you can see matrix A. I don't know if you can. Yeah, here. And it defines how the elements of the system are connected. So in this case, of the networks, it's just the transpose of adjacency matrix. Then we have a matrix B. It's called input matrix. It actually identifies where we have the input in the system. In this, for example, this is a small example of 4 nodes network. We have input in the node number 1, and it could be also weighted. C is the output matrix, and it identifies the nodes where we read the output. In this case, we read the output at the node number 3 and 4, and it also could be weighted. And D is the feed-forward matrix, and it's usually 0, and here it's 0 because we don't have direct connection between input and output. So it identifies the direct connection.
So just for clarification, when you have a 1 over 0 or maybe a weight, that would suggest, for example, whether a node is active, for example, infected or not, when in the system that you observe after your input?
So it just means that we observe that output. If it's 0, we just don't know what's going on.
But it's the state of the node.
The state of a node is identified with another vector here. So besides these matrices, we have some vectors. There is a state vector. It's X. So X is a state vector. It identifies the state of a system in each point of time. We have U. That's actually the input vector, and that's how we identify the input signal. And we have Y. That's the output. That's actually the response that we need to calculate. So how we can solve this? There are several ways how we can solve. One of the ways, which is very commonly used in telecommunication engineering, it's transforming that into the transfer function. And so transfer function defines the system completely. That's one function. And if we put some input into the transfer function, and we just need to multiply the input with transfer function, and then we read the output. However, it all has to be done in complex domain, or frequency domain. And then we do inverse Laplace transform to the time domain. And then we can read the output in time domain, because it's easier to calculate in frequency domain. So there is just a formula how we can transfer, how we can make we can calculate transfer function from those system matrices. So from state space representation to transfer function. So for example, if we want to calculate the step response, we take transfer function, which is there in here. It's a transfer function. We multiply it with step signal, for example. It's in Z domain, in complex domain. And then we just do the inverse Z transform. Z transform is for discrete systems, because we usually deal with discrete systems, not with continuous systems. So since we deal also with discrete systems, it allows us to use another way of calculating this, to solving this. It's actually first thing is that finding this inverse is hard for large matrices, but that's another topic. So we can use another way to solve this. It's called iterative solution. So we just go through those difference equations in each time step, and then we calculate the output in time 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we can decide how many time steps we can calculate. So it's actually easier to implement in programmatically. So the question is, can we use this system response, no matter how we calculate it, so we calculate it somehow, to identify the most influential spreaders in a network? And we argue yes. So in this small network, we have some input. Yeah, sorry.
Question. So when you say network, are you and you referred to epidemics before? This is an epidemic, a representation of an epidemic, like an actual disease network where people are spreading diseases. Is that the use case that you're talking about?
So I'm talking about just a graph. And so we see how, so actually the thing which we observe here, this output, does not represent directly the epidemic, but it could be used to identify the most influential spreaders. Like, for example, if you use some kind of centrality measure, it doesn't measure really the epidemic. But we can say, if some node is central, it's most probably that this will spread the virus or something like that quickly.
Okay.
For example.
Okay.
So when you talk about the matrix A, do you check whether or not it's exponentially stable, Lyapunov stable, and so on?
Yeah. So the thing is that this approach works for stable systems, but it could be also work for unstable systems. But it would be out of the scope of this talk. Yeah. So in this example, for example, we have an input in node number 1, and then we read outputs somewhere. Then we read the response. And for stable systems, the response would look like that, something like this curve there. And that will eventually reach its maximum value. And if we read that value, we get some. So we read those values here. And that's actually the maximum value of step response for each of those nodes as a source, as an input. And then we read output in all other nodes. And those values are normalized. So that's actually our proposed node imposed response, NIR value. So if you rate, on the left-hand side, we can see the NRI, the nodes rated by NRI value. And on the right-hand side, they are rated by how quickly they could spread the infection. It's just a simulation of spreading. So we can see that the same nodes who have high NRI value also infect the network quickly.
So what is the assumption on the diffusion mechanism? Here you're using something like SIS, SIR, it doesn't matter?
I used both. I used SI and then SIR with different parameters. But actually, finally, parameters does not matter that much. So, for example, for SIR model, like recovery could be 1, like recovery rate could be also 1, no matter what we use. But I'll show the simulation later.
Yeah, because I find it a little bit hard to interpret how you can really have a notion of influence that is independent of the diffusion mechanism. So if you transition, say, from an epidemic model like SI whatever to information diffusion model like independent cascade or linear threshold model. Any threshold model.
So I use SI and SIR. And for SI, I calculate how quickly the epidemics will spread, like how quickly the epidemics will reach 50 or more % of the network. And for SIR, I rate the number of recovered nodes. So it's after the epidemics is done.
And sorry, the last question, but if you answer this later, just feel free to tell me. So, I mean, depending on the structure of the network itself, scale-free versus not, and so on, there are all these, nice results about the vanishing thresholds and etc. So here it's, these examples are of course for small networks, so you can assume any.
So I will go. Okay. I will come to that. So we see some correlation there with small networks. So it's time to go big, and we try with large scale simulations, with larger scale simulations. So I take, for example, one network from one network family, and I don't just simulate the epidemics on that single network, I make 100 networks out of that network with the same degree distribution. I use this Hakimi algorithm then because it's able to make a graph from a given degree sequence. So I take sample and then I make a graph. So I do the following analysis. So I take a single network, then I simulate the infection and spreading dynamics by infecting each of the nodes individually. And then for those nodes, I read how quickly they could spread the infection. If the node spreads the infection quickly, I put it on the top. So I rate the nodes. If it's less quickly, then I put it below, and so on. So I rate nodes by the how quickly they could spread the infection as a source. Then I use some centrality measure. And then I rate nodes based on that centrality measure. So I take our measure, NIR measure, or between a centrality, coherence degree, dynamic sensitive centrality, and H index. And then, if the ratings between the simulation and the centrality, if they rated similarly, it means that the correlation is large. So I use Kendall-Stau correlation. If the ratings are dissimilar, it means that correlation is low. So the goal is to find the measure which could capture the system, the spreading dynamics. Yes?
Yeah, sorry, could you explain DS?
DS is dynamic sensitive centrality. It's recently, it's a work from 2016, and I just incorporated it.
How does it work? Approximately, what's a node's DS?
It takes, I don't remember exactly, but the most important thing is that you need to have some additional information like transmission probability and recovery probability in order to calculate it. So let's get back on my point. So I don't get just one measure of correlation. Because I have 100 networks, I get the distribution of correlations. So I have many correlations there. So I take this NREN network, for example, and I make 100 networks with the same degree distribution, then I calculate correlations for all of them just to make sure that this works. So how we read this plot, it means that if the plot is higher the better, because the correlation is higher. And it's also the narrower the better, the more narrow the better. It means that it's accurate most of the times if it's narrow. If it's not too narrow, it means that we cannot trust it all of the time. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So here we can evaluate our measure, NRI measure, with SI model, which is a really simple model. And it performs really well. So it's not here just presented with 2 networks. I did it with 8 different networks. So there were citation networks and telecommunication networks, etc. And also with SIR model, it works well. So it's always either the best or it shares the first place with some other measure. So it's really reliable. So actually the conclusion of this first part is that NRI can successfully capture the node importance in case of an epidemic. And it shows small variance, which means it's reliable for different topologies. And also this padding of the LTI approach allows the numerous variations of the original metric. It's really, so we can, for example, examine the possible influence of a group of the nodes to another group of the nodes, or a single node to the group of the nodes, and stuff like that. And we can calculate it. So another part of the research was dealing with the cascading failures analysis. within the particular European NREN network. So this is analysis of the specific network, and there are some optimization techniques and the risk assessment and recommendations. First, I'm going to explain quickly one of the models which I used for cascading failures. It's a Monterey model, and this is how it works. So at the beginning, we have free flow network, where we have some loads and capacities of the nodes. At the beginning, everything works smoothly, because in this model, it is assumed that capacities are a bit larger than initial load. And how much larger is defined by this tolerance parameter alpha. So we decide how much larger it is at the beginning. But what happens if a single node fails? Then rerouting occurs, and then it could cause possible congestion. So another node could be overloaded. And in this model, it is also considered to be failed. And then further rerouting occurs, and then possible further failures. And finally, we have something like this. This is the remaining functional network after the cascade. And this is the largest connected component, the largest remaining connected component, and we use it to quantify the damage. So if the largest component is small, it means the damage is big. So I use this model, one more model, but I'm just going to stick to this one, for analysis of an NREN network. What is NREN? NREN is the network which connects over 50 million users in European, all around Europe, and it provides connectivity between universities and public institutes. It's a very important network because it connects, for example, CERN and other research institutions. And this network is a backbone, so I have a topology of a backbone of the NREN network. So we analyzed that network. So we first analyzed like individual failure, and we can see here that so we see how the relative size of the giant component decreases after the initial failure over time. So if you have initial failures, the giant component will decrease the size of the giant component.
So this is by targeting and destroying one node.
So this case is just individual failure. We just destroy one node and see what's going to happen. But we also have some kind of unexpected results, let's say. So at the beginning, we would expect that the really loaded node would cause the highest damage, but it's not always the case. So here we see the example of some node which is not really the most loaded at the beginning, but it would cause higher damage because its failure causes the overloading of some other nodes, which we didn't expect. And also, we don't have just one important node. We have a set of very important nodes with similar possible damage. And also, it becomes even more interesting if we change our tolerance parameter alpha. So then that set changes completely. But however, some nodes appear to be always critical. So we can pinpoint some nodes which should be protected.
The alpha is the tolerance, or is the...
It's a tolerance parameter. And in this model, alpha tells us how much the capacity of the node is larger from its initial load. So
that would be 1%, 10%, 30%.
Yeah. So the larger the alpha, actually the cascade is the less damage is made, but it costs. So the larger the alpha, it costs. Right.
Sorry, do all nodes have the same load initially, or is it drawn from a distribution?
No, they have different loads. So the load is, so we assume that nodes communicate with shortest path between each other. It's just a simple assumption. And then we calculate actually the betweenness centrality. And so the load is actually the betweenness centrality of node. In reality, it's not always like that because we have some adaptive routing protocols and stuff like that. But this is just we cannot calculate all of this. Then it becomes too complicated.
It also varies over time.
Yeah,
it's not fixed.
Maybe it's capacity. I'm thinking of the nodes at the same capacity, or are they different capacities?
No. So the capacity is assumed based on the load. So
okay,
we would say
that
the node with larger load also has a larger capacity.
So its capacity is just alpha times the load. You calculate the load's capacity is alpha times that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the load, the capacity is a bit larger than the load.
Yeah.
Then also we can analyze multiple simultaneous failures. So we can fail 2, 3, 5 nodes. And also we have the same thing here. So we have like most central couple, like the two nodes with the largest load. If we remove them, they would cause some damage. But some other couple of the nodes, which is not obviously most central, causes a larger damage. And also it also becomes really interesting analysis because, for example, if you want to find 5 critical nodes, there is not just one set of 5 really important nodes. There are more than 5, which could cause the similar damage. But also some nodes appear to be often in those sets. So we can also pinpoint really important nodes. For example, this time, Oslo and Frankfurt are important in this analysis. And another problem is the very large solution space in this case. So it's, you have to adapt to that. And also the failures are usually caused by some external factor. So it could be power outage, or it could be earthquake or flood or something like that. And then it usually affects the nodes which are very close geographically. So we did like this geographically correlated failures analysis. So it also, the area, it depends on the area, how large area we can fail. This is like some of the commonsensical, I think I'm frozen, okay. Like commonsensical assumption that critical areas often incorporate critical nodes, but it's not always the case. So sometimes we have critical areas which do not have very important nodes, but that area seems to be really important as the area. So we can also put some more layers, like here I used it's like a earthquake risk. So it's a map of the earthquake risk, simply said. So if I plot nodes on that map, so we can do two-dimensional analysis, for example. So we plot node importance on the horizontal axis, and we plot earthquake risk on the horizontal axis, and we would assume that nodes in the upper right corner would be really highly combined risk. But however, after this analysis, we realized that European NREN is quite safe against the earthquakes. But then we can extend that, so we can put some other risks, and we can say multidimensional analysis. And also we did it also with areas, not just with nodes, but it's another topic. And then we come to protection strategies, how to protect the network from cascades. The first one is a little bit counterintuitive. So it means that we remove nodes. So after the failure, we destroy some nodes, and then we stop the cascade. So we actually remove the least loaded nodes. So we remove the fraction of least loaded nodes, and then we stop the cascade. So in this plot, we can see how, so if there is a single node failure, and then we iteratively remove the fraction of nodes, and then you can see what is the remaining giant component after the failure. So we can see that after some 2%, between 2 and 10% nodes, so it's just enough to remove 2% of highly loaded nodes, then we could stop the cascade or decrease the cascade. After 10% of nodes, it doesn't help anymore. So it just adds to the cascade.
So when the slide says the least loaded, but you say the most loaded. So which one is which?
Did I? Okay. I didn't. It's a least loaded.
Okay.
So we remove the least loaded node.
So that's the counterintuitive part.
Just the counterintuitive part is that we destroy the network in order to save the network.
I mean, that's less counterintuitive if you think at epidemics.
Yeah.
Inoculating a user, vaccinating someone is equivalent to sort of destroying it, or you remove it from the pool of infectious or potentially susceptible people, right? So the idea is commonplace in epidemics, but the fact that removing the low load cascade...
I can explain why. So assumption is that all nodes produce similar amount of traffic, and if we remove, so we should remove the amount of traffic from the network by causing the least damage, and that would be just we remove the least loaded, we removed a lot of traffic, but they are not hubs, so that's the like the reason for that, yeah. And those are, for example, candidates for removal. So we just cannot remove any nodes, but just least loaded are those. So we can just choose. However, we don't have always control over the whole network, so we have just localized control. And there are some local protection strategy by protective zone. So after the failure in one area, we can remove the nodes from a bit wider area. And then we put cascade to the halt, or we just decrease the cascade. You mentioned that it's very common in epidemics. However, the nature of the failures here in this cascading failures is a little bit different than epidemics. So that's why it's a bit counterintuitive. However, for some things, for some nodes, for some areas, we have this protective zone. Sometimes we don't have it, and sometimes the radius is different. And finally, there is a costly protection strategy, so that we have to invest some money. So costly protection strategy means that we just increase the capacity of a node. So what would happen if we increase the capacity of this node in the center? Nothing after this failure, because it would protect the node, the network from the failure. And identifying those nodes is important. So I call it protective hubs. So after the failure of this node here, black node, so those nodes will be overloaded. And if we increase the capacity of those initially overloaded nodes, we protect the network completely from cascade. However, that costs, and it's a matter of optimization, how much we can protect it. And also for different alpha, there's different sets. And for different nodes, there are different protective hubs. But we can also identify some protective hubs which are very often protective hubs. So that's following us. And I'm going to show you a small video. It's like an illustration. It's animation, how the cascade spreads through the network. It uses another model, but it's very similar to this model line. Now you cannot hear, but okay. No, sorry. cut. I mean, it was a bit slower than it should. Okay.
Can I ask a question on this? So, what I've seen in a lot of the computer network failures is that they talk a lot about network weather, and they describe the congestion and the failures in terms of how many messages you can put through links. So here you focus very much on the network node failures. So how would you think about failures in the links or degrees of failure given their degree of congestion, I guess?
Sure. We focused on nodes. We can also just switch the analysis to links, and it's very similar. We, instead of computing between us like of the node, we can also compute the load of the links, and the analysis is very similar. But we just focus on the nodes because the links here in these backbone networks are not an issue at all. So the links are, let's say, over-engineered. So we don't have any problem with speed in backbone networks. We have problem with capacities of nodes. That's the thing. Yeah, but also links could be analyzed as well. The problem with links is with smaller networks, like local networks. Yeah, they have that problem.
Yeah, so in this case, if you have a lot of sites moving terabytes of data around, then the level of congestion matters a lot in the links. Okay, thanks.
I agree. So since you were a good audience, I'm just going to give a small bonus talk about. So I was visiting artificial intelligence lab in Brussels, and they were doing some game theory experiment, and I was working there a little bit. So I'm just going to explain. It's really interesting. So what's the game theory? I guess many of you are familiar with it. What does it mean? But I'm just going quickly to explain with this famous prisoner's dilemma example. So we have two guys. They put them in a prison in two separate cells, and depending on their move, on their move and the move of their opponent, there is an outcome. So they could either confess or remain silent. And if they both confess, they stay 5 years. And if they both remain silent, they stay 1 year. But one could confess and another could remain silent, and this one is free then. But another one is punished. He has 20 years. So a single player could get 5 years or 0 years, but he could also stay 20 years in, depending on the opponent's move. So this is kind of payoff matrix, how much they could get or what they can lose. So players could actually could collaborate or could defect. And they don't play it just once. So they usually play it in sequences, so many games. And then we have some various strategies. So there could be various strategies of players. So for example, this guy almost always collaborates. So he is kind of good guy. This guy almost always defects. This guy just copies the opponent. Whatever the opponent does in previous round, he does the same. And this guy is, for example, completely confused. He doesn't even know what he's doing. And so there was an experiment with 60 students playing against each other in a random network. So they were coupled, and then they were decoupled and coupled with some other player. And they were playing the game on tablets, just collaborating or defecting. Collaborating, and it also depends what they could see what their opponent did in previous move.
Only one previous move, or
only one previous? Yeah, but they could remember. Yeah. And they could see, and then they could arrange their strategies to earn money. So they were earning real money.
So they would be paired again after each round randomly to other opponents, or?
So they were paired randomly. against other opponent, yes, after each round. But they were playing several rounds with the same opponent also. So when I came there, the idea was, my job was to cluster the players based on the moves sequence to see how many, so my question was how many different strategies are used. Okay, so that was the question which I had to answer in some weeks. And so I used actually the adapted k-means among others, so I also used the conditional random field, but this is interesting to explain how it works. It's a little bit different than typical k-means algorithm. So with the typical, with k-means algorithm, we have some solutions, those are dots, we have some sequences, and then we have some centroids. So if the solution, then we calculate the distance between the solution and the centroid, and if the solution is close to the centroid, it belongs to that cluster. So each solution belongs to the closest centroid. So it's usually Euclidean distance that we can calculate, and then we move centroids, and then we can cluster it better. However, in our case, we did something different. So the solution is actually the played sequence, and the centroid is hidden Markov model. And if the distance is actually the probability that that hidden Markov model will produce that sequence. So if the probability is low, it means they are distant. If the probability is high, it means they are close. So how this works iteratively? So first we cluster them somehow, like we put pseudo random hidden Markov model, and then we cluster them, which one is closer. Then we train the hidden Markov model based on the all the players in the first cluster. And then we move we move the centroid. We have another Markov model there. Then we cluster them again, and we do it over and over until there is no significant change. I mean, there could be one change that one guy goes from one to another cluster all the time, but then we just stop. And so that was the main idea behind this adapted k-means algorithm, which works here really well. So also works really well with the simulations and with the real players. But to spice things up, we didn't just take the simple sequence of the moves. We assume that the move of the player depends on opponent's move in the previous round, and it also depends on his own move in previous round. So we actually take those triples, and then we map them, and then we take the sequence of those mapped triples, and then that's how we kind of try to understand how many of those different strategies are. And so we find out that in this sample there are 4 clusters. Oh. So it's like 4 natural strategies in those group of 60 students. But you should take these results with caution, because it's only 60 students and it's really small sample size. So, but it was fun. Interesting approach. Yeah. Done. Thanks.
All right. Okay. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, even though we have many questions to the talk either.
Yeah, no, last part is very interesting there about the hidden Markov model and stuff. So loads of questions there actually, but so I guess is it just kind of Bernoulli process? You condition on past states, you just predict the current state with some probability and fit the probabilities to data. Is that how you do it?
I mean, how we train the hidden Markov.
Yeah.
Well, there are 2 algorithms to it. One is the Baum-Walsh algorithm, and another is Viterbi algorithm. And we used I used Baum-Walsh algorithm. And honestly, I don't know exactly how it works. I read, but I forgot the details. And, but it takes many sequences, and then it produces hidden Markov model. You can say how many hidden states could be there. So we tried with 3, 4, 5 hidden states to see how it works.
Sorry, so you got 4 clusters. Could you kind of interpret the models to see?
It's really difficult to interpret to see how they actually behave. For simple, if you take just a simple sequence of moves, we could interpret because we can understand. So we see that those people who collaborate, for example, they kind of gain a lot of money together. But also we have a group of people who collaborates, and they play with people who always defects, and those people who defects, they kind of use them. They just earn a lot of money. So by observing that kind of groups, we can see, but this is really difficult to predict. To say this is the typical behavior. So we were able just to say there are 4 different strategies.
So, and this assumes also that the strategy that the user plays or employs is constant, is always the same strategy.
Yeah, there is a lot of noise there. So, as I said, there are those people who have no idea what they are doing. And yeah, some people just change strategy in the middle of a game, and that's it. As I said, it's a really small sample. So.
What is the main difference between your diffusion model and something like linear threshold model? They seem to be pretty similar because they both kind of have a
threshold. So linear threshold is when you have help me.
You have a weight assigned to the node, and then if enough neighbors add up to above that sum, then that guy turns on.
So linear threshold model has a threshold.
Yeah.
And here we don't have any threshold.
Isn't it L times alpha? Isn't that your threshold?
You're talking about the cascading. Okay,
yeah.
I was thinking about okay. So the thing is that this cascade, it's not a diffusion model. This which I used here, it's a little bit different from diffusion in a network.
How so?
I think the nature of the thing, how things spread here in Cascade are a little bit different. Let me think what's the main difference. So if we the node will always have the same number of neighbors. Actually, that's the first difference. And if there is one failure, the number of neighbors is always the same. And then after time, so some will be overloaded. Yeah.
So I think what
I
you're
don't know
saying is
what's the main difference. I have to think about it to make just a real difference, but I think it's a bit different from that kind of.
So this was, by the way, my same original question I was asking, what was the difference? So the way I understood it is that in this case it's kind of adapted to the changing structure of the network. So when you remove a node, the network changes, while maybe in traditional threshold models you would assume that the network is static, and what changes is just whether a node is active or not.
Maybe we could model the same thing with linear threshold. Maybe it would cause we would get the same or similar results.
So I do have a question that is actually kind of a follow-up on what Fred was saying. So in the first part, which was the one that I was very excited about on the simulations of the spreading and so on. So in this section, I was expecting to see maybe towards the end a little bit more analysis, like comparative analysis across, for example, classes of networks. I don't know if maybe you didn't put it there for interest of time, but so you say you explore different classes, but at the end you were just presenting the results for the citation network, like the HEPT and the IPv6 and so on. But have you done any work in with synthetic networks generated from some generative model like Barabasi Albert or?
I did. So I made analysis with 8 networks. So
these are real networks.
So 6 are real, 2 are made. Okay. So 2 are like scale-free network, and 2 are scale-free. 1 is scale-free, Barabasi Albert network. That's what I use. Yes. I have. I don't have all of them on the slides, but in paper they are there.
So it would be interesting to see, for example, there what's the role of the different parameters for both in the phase of the generation of the model and in general understanding how the network structure affects the diffusion in this case of the cascade cascading failures, and also how this is reflected by this LTI representation, right? So I assume that the maybe phase transitions that emerge might not be obvious.
But phase transitions here are really important, interesting, because they only in the transition moment in the network the system behaves linearly. So that's why this is actually could be used, this linear time invariant model. But also besides that, it's really interesting area for research, because it's not very often used in complex systems. It just recently started that people started to deal with it. Just with Barabashi, recently I had a talk in Indiana University. So they deal with that also.
Anyone else? All right, in that case, please take Goran again. And so it's going to be around until the end of the day. So if you didn't manage to schedule a meeting, please do, and we'll fly back to